In this session, we are going to talk about church communications. We're going to talk about discipleship, and we might even touch on some words like advertising and marketing that generally we don't like to think about those in church terms, but we're going to dive in and see how they fit. Welcome. My name is Greg Simpson. I'm the minister at St. Andrew's United Church in downtown Chatham, Ontario. What a blessing it is to join you in this session of church visioning, of dreaming about what the future of our church might look like, and doing some work and looking at ourselves and who we are today, in wondering aloud about where the future might be taking us, and to spend some time in prayerful consideration about what God is calling us into. I want to thank you so much for joining me, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't get to do these things. And I want to also say a huge thank you to every single church leader that I have listened to, that I've spoken with, that I've read their work. I want to thank all of the church members that I've had the blessing of working with, because it is because of everybody working together that we continue to learn and grow and be God's people. The idea of everybody working together, I think, is a really big piece of this church communications conversation. And I'm going to jump right in and talk about discipleship just for a minute. And if we're already church people, then the phrase discipleship probably doesn't make us too uncomfortable. And I use that word only because the word evangelism often does make people feel uncomfortable. It's got some baggage attached to it, but the two words in the root of them have a lot of similarity. And they're really just the church words that describe letting everybody else know what we're doing, telling people what we're up to, and very often inviting them to get involved. That's what discipleship is. That's what Jesus encouraged us and his followers many, many years ago to do, to go and to make disciples of all the nations. So what's that look like? See, the first step is that make disciples. I think very often we as churches get stuck in the process of being disciples. And that is a beautiful thing, and it is a necessary thing. But we need to take a step deeper and recognize that Jesus is calling us to make disciples. Now, it's very true that you can hardly make a disciple if you don't know what a disciple is, and you can't really know what a disciple is if you're not one yourself. So we'll start with a little bit of breaking down of words. A disciple is one who follows, who learns at the feet of. Somebody who, and the word disciple is definitely related to discipline, not as in disciplining a child for doing something they shouldn't have done, but discipline more like there are lots of occupations that have disciplines that describe how the work is to be done. You follow a particular discipline of a writer or perhaps an artist, or you as a musician have a discipline that you follow. And if you note, I'm naming off creative types of people. Discipline has a creativity to it. You're following in the footsteps, you're learning, and you're becoming a creator alongside. And we as a church are becoming creators alongside the Creator, alongside our Creator. And so as disciples, we become co-creators with God, following Jesus' direction. So that all sounds pretty comfortable and churchy, but where does that then step into Jesus' instruction that we make disciples of the whole world? Well, it can start by us doing what we do best to build up each other and to encourage each other to be disciples and learn more about how we can be disciples and become more creative in sharing God's word and being the hands and feet of God in this world and making sure that everything we do and say carries God's unconditional love into the world. That's us individually, and it's a beautiful thing. But as a church, as a group of individuals, as a congregation, there's more to it than that. We've got to tell people what we're up to. And sometimes we know we have to do that. If we're going to run an event, we're gathering up some of the folks and we're going to go bowling together. We got to let other people know and invite them along. There might be an advertisement that goes along with that. There might be a few phone calls made to let people know. We're going to call some friends and say, hey, I'm going bowling with the church. Do you want to come and do it? Or another example, which is more of an outreach-driven one, is we're going to do an event where perhaps we will host a meal for the community, a meal that has zero cost of entry, but you can donate if you'd like to. And it's a sort of outreach thing where we're going to connect people together. There are many churches who do things like this where they actually, especially in small communities, they shut down a chunk of road and line the road with tables and they feed everybody who shows up. You probably have heard of this sort of thing. It might happen in your community. It's a beautiful example. Well, that takes a ton of volunteers to make happen. And so we're going to have to let the volunteers know. We're going to have to call the volunteers we know. We're going to have to reach out maybe to some of the establishments in our community that do food-related things, whether it's restaurants or maybe our grocery stores. We're going to have to do communications. We're going to have to let them know. And then we'll have to put out a call for volunteers. We'll probably have to do that maybe in an advertisement that we'll put in our local newspaper, or maybe we'll rent a sign that goes on the side of the road. As people drive by, they'll know that we're looking for volunteers. And in more modern days, perhaps we're going to reach out to our Facebook friends and we'll do something on Facebook, or we'll put something on the church website. Maybe it'll go out via a tweet, or it'll go as part of a worship service that is also being streamed live, or maybe it's recorded and then gets put on YouTube later. These are very direct and critical ways of making sure the things we do as church get shared. They are discipleship. They are also marketing and advertising. And so in my notes, as I was preparing for this, I just have the words marketing equals with that little squiggly on top, which means like kind of equal to or parallel to discipleship. Marketing is like discipleship, and discipleship is like marketing. And the reason I say that is because if I were to show up at a church committee meeting and talk about just marketing, they would worry that maybe I've stepped too deeply into the business side of my background and I'm forgetting about the church. This is a church. We don't do advertising. We don't do marketing. So instead, I show up and I talk about discipleship. And I talk about evangelism. And I talk about carrying our message into the world, sharing God's love and kindness with the world, sharing the work of the church, of God's people, with the rest of the community. Well, that is only going to happen if you put words in front of the community, if you put messages and pictures and videos, if you connect with all the people you know and tell them what you're doing. And so that means that we as churches have to take a very critical look at the ways we are connecting with our communities and the ways we are not connecting with our communities. Now, as you may know, my background is in technology. I was actually a software developer for almost 2 decades before I went into ministry. And so I have some lived experience in this particular category. And sometimes that really helps. And sometimes it gets in the way because there are some assumptions that I'm the tech guy. Well, the reality is that my wisdom in tech has a very narrow band of knowledge. And even though I wrote websites and I created content management systems, that doesn't make me an expert on social media. I spend a bit of time in social media, but I'm by no means an expert. But what I do know is there are an awful lot of people in the world who don't know anything about me, or they don't know anything about St. Andrews, who would love to know what we're doing. They would love to come help volunteer, or they might even write a check to help out with some of the projects we're working on. Or they might show up to clean the church, or maybe paint the walls when we're doing something around the building, or they might rake some leaves when we want to make the space look better. Or if we were going to head out to a community space and do some gardening to make a park look beautiful, maybe they would show up. Or maybe there are some young people who would love to do alongside some of the work that our youth are doing. But if they don't know that it's going on, then in some ways we are missing that part of our mission. We're missing that instruction from Jesus to go and make disciples of the people. Remember how I said that discipleship was an idea of following? We can actually make or help people follow Jesus' message by just doing a thing and inviting them to come do it with us. But if they don't know about it, if they don't hear about it, how are we ever going to help them be a disciple? How are we ever going to share this beautiful thing that we know and love and do so well if we don't let them know? Here's where there's some hard truths that we have to face. We as a world are in the middle of the biggest shift in communications in 500 years. It's fairly clear right now that the internet is not a fad, that worldwide digital communications are here to stay. And if we look at the way communication has changed, the previous biggest change was probably the printing press. So sure, there's been lots of little modifications and updates, but in general, until digital communications, it was all about sharing papers with words on them. Or maybe making them really big so they're billboards with words on them. Or maybe making it a way that we could share those papers in easier ways or more bulk ways. But before the internet, before email, before digital communications, there had to be a paper with words that got in front of somebody's face. It's not the only way now. And so the next step for visioning that you must do as a church is look at, are there any ways that you could take some of the message that you're giving and bring it in front of people who are only seeing digital communications? Now, this is a very, very tricky balance. And we here at St. Andrews deal with this balance all the time because we have many members, many people who are deeply involved in the church who don't communicate in digital means or just aren't comfortable with it, or it's not automatic. And then we've got some people who check 3 or 4 different types of social media plus their email 8 or 9 times a day, maybe more if we're completely honest about it. And we have to balance those people and those different congregations. And so in our conversations here, we've broken our congregation down into 3 different distinct groups. And it really helps, as anytime we're talking about communications, to really identify those groups. And I'm going to invite you to do this same work. And in your head, or maybe even jot down who you know that falls into each one of these 3 different congregations. And really, within your congregation, all of these people exist, but you really have to address them and communicate with them in different ways. So I'm going to start with one, and they're probably some of the people that we know very, very well. And there's a good chance that they have been part of our church and they've been around for a long time. And they maybe aren't interested in being involved with our church in digital fashions. They didn't sign up for the email newsletter because they don't get email. Now, the good news is that the pandemic has definitely invited many people who were not going to jump on board with technology. It has really pulled them in because it was the only way that they were going to communicate with their kids, whether it's a Skype call or Google Meets or even just catching up with some pictures online. There are many more people involved digitally than ever before. And so that first part of our congregation actually has probably shrunk in the last 2 years. There are more people who are digitally engaged than ever before. But some of those people might still choose not to be. So we need to know that there is a congregation who are not interested in communicating digitally. We need to name them. We need to know that list and be very, very clear about who they are to make sure that we continue to serve them, connect with them, and communicate with them so they don't feel left out as we shift to talking about these other two congregations and the ways that we're going to communicate with them. These are beautiful people who it is on the work that they have done in the past that we get to continue to be church. Don't forget about them, friends, but recognize also that they are one segment of your population. And this is hard because it used to be that you could put it in a newsletter and send it to everybody, and that was about all you needed to do. But I'm going to show you in just a second that if you continue to do that as your only way of doing church, you're going to miss out on all of these people. Congregation number 2 are honestly the easiest ones. They are kind of the people that we see lots of Sundays. They are quite engaged digitally. They are also more than happy to get a paper newsletter from us. We're probably going to see them frequently enough. They're still helping out around the building. They're doing some of the things within our missions. Lots of these people are people who are leading our missions. We see them and connect with them both digitally and not digitally. And so through the pandemic, as we had different times where we could be open or not, these people were actually some of the easiest to connect with because they were more than willing to join a Zoom call or watch a live stream. Or once they were feeling comfortable to meet in a group when we were doing it in a safe way, they were showing up as well. They are honestly the easiest to talk to, which means often they're our default go-to. And the good news is that this is probably a large group of people. If we were to draw a pie chart, I'm going to say that this is a very, very big chunk of the pie. But we can't only focus on them, but we can make sure that we do the work to keep them connected, and we can ask them very easily how best they want us to communicate with them, how they want us to encourage them to be connected with the church, and how we want to invite them into further discipleship. And then we have congregation number 3. This is people we might not know as well. This is people who might not know much about us. And in days gone by, the only real way that we got to know the people of congregation number 3 was if one of these 2 congregations met with them and invited them to come to church, or invited them to come along to the meal that was being provided for everybody, or invited them to volunteer for this particular event because it was something that we knew they would love. Or maybe there was a particular program that was designed at reaching people in the community and we would connect with them. It was mostly word of mouth. Sometimes there were advertisements in our local newspaper, or like I said, billboards, signage. That's how we used to connect with them. But the reality is that the age of these people means that most of them live and breathe digital. And we also know that these congregations, the 2 that we already know well, they are aging. They will continue to age, and unfortunately, we will lose them at some point. If we are not doing the work of engaging with this congregation in the place where they are looking, in the place where they are reading their news and they are consuming their content, if we are not showing up in their news feeds in one way or another, then we're invisible to them. And we are missing an immense segment of the population. Maybe you're not. And if you're not, congratulations. That probably puts you in the tiniest segment of church life. When I read blog posts and listen to podcasts of church leaders all across North America, they speak about how hard it is to shift existing churches into a mentality that addresses people who are online only. In fact, if you look at any media, at any business structure, we have so many businesses that have struggled to connect. One great example is the company Blockbuster. Lots of us know about this company. It used to rent videos. And I'm old enough to remember Blockbuster, though I also grew up in the country and there wasn't one close by. But we definitely had a couple of video rental stores in our local community. And that whole industry has completely disappeared. It has been replaced by online content. And we as churches do get to decide if we want to be a Blockbuster model or if we want to find some way of creating a hybrid, of making sure that we continue to serve the people who maybe do need to receive a sermon as a video cassette, or they do need to get a tape, or they do need to get a phone call and they're not going to get it in a digital fashion. But we need to also make sure that we are doing our discipleship, that we are reaching out to the people of the world who are not finding us in other ways. So how do we do that? Well, some of you already know these answers and some of you already are doing these answers, and I congratulate you for doing them. You have to have a website. It is literally not possible to exist in the world for congregation number 3 if you don't have a website. And a website, I hate to break it to you, is not just a digital billboard. People expect websites to be things that are refreshed and renewed, things that have updated information. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. And I will admit to you, it is a complicated and difficult thing. I'll spend another session getting deeper into some of the tech that we can do, but I'm just going to encourage you, you have to have a website. It has to be effective. It has to be updated frequently. And that's probably going to cost you. It will definitely cost you some time. Maybe you have a volunteer who can help out. it probably will cost you some money as well. But if you don't invest in that way, you are missing congregation number 3. In fact, you're probably missing a good segment of congregation number 2, but they are also a very lovely and forgiving lot, and they will forgive you. You just don't exist for these people. There are also ways to connect via social media. I'm not going to tell you today how or why or which ones, because that's a very long and complicated question. So I can invite you to come back to another session that will be all specifically about social media. Friends, we are called deeply into making disciples of the world. The only way that we can do that is by communicating, by letting the world know what we're up to, by celebrating the wins, by struggling in our losses, by being vulnerable as we look at ourselves and look at how we fit or don't fit in our modern worlds. And as you are doing vision at work, that as you are imagining what God is calling you into, as you are spending time in prayer, as you are looking at the structures of your church and looking for where they have to change and where they're working just fine, I want you to continue to wonder aloud in small groups, in big groups, about how you as a church are reaching these 3 congregations. You need to meet them all. And the blessing is that if you meet them all, your church will thrive. You as a congregation and as a community will grow, because all of these people have beautiful things to offer. And all of these people will draw you in new and exciting and creative places. Go and be disciples of Christ by connecting with the world and making disciples of the world. Thank you so much for joining me in this session, friends. I will see you again soon. I love you all. Bye for now.